he's been handed a really difficult situation in that, when he was in the running to be Fed chair, the case that could be made for cutting rates was sort of somewhat reasonable. Maybe growth was slowing down a little bit, especially from the sort of weeks post-pandemic. The labor market was looking a little sort of slacker than it had been, and inflation was sort of reasonably well contained. And none of those things are really true seemingly anymore. There was a pretty good jobs number recently because of the huge capital spending that we talked about earlier on the show. Actually, the US economy looks to be doing sort of pretty nicely. Growth is pretty robust now, largely thanks to that sort of AI boom capex. And then at the same time, like you mentioned, there's been sort of all of these sort of upward pressures on inflation. The sort of closing the Strait of Hormuz has pushed up fuel prices, gas prices. It's pushed up electricity prices, and you're starting to see it affect grocery prices, most sort of cleanly through fertilizer channels. A lot of fertilizer goes through the Strait of Hormuz, and so things like, tomatoes, which use a lot of fertilizer, are now really expensive. So, some of those inflationary pressures are things that you might think you could look through as like supply side-y type stuff as the Fed chair, but very, very difficult to credibly make a case for rate cuts with a straight face, essentially.
Can they make a case for rate hikes, that you need more bad medicine to finally do this?
Yeah, I think you can certainly make a case for rate hikes more than you can for the reverse. And in some ways, like, that would be not unnatural for Kevin Warsh, in that when he was a Fed governor under Bernanke before, he was like something of a hawk, especially about QE, quantitative easing, or the bond buying programs that the Fed was doing, because, he sort of worried about it distorting markets, and he really didn't want the Fed's balance sheet getting too big and becoming too sort of unwieldy. And so his sort of sentiment seemed to be that the Fed should, be sort of restrained and not too interventionist institution. And that tends to go hand in hand with sort of hawkishness in general, which would indicate that, you should keep monetary policy tight and potentially sort of hike rates. The case for the rate hike, I guess, is everything that I just mentioned. The growth is fine. The labor market seems all right. And you do have CPI inflation, headline inflation at 3.8%, which is obviously above the 2% target. And it never really got back down below the target post-COVID. So it's now been above target for 5 years.
So if you are a rules-based Fed, right, and you have a dual mandate as full employment and to keep inflation arrested, and you're not supposed to be beholden to politics or midterm election stuff, like, could you imagine if they had to come out with an emergency rate hike, if they get much hotter than you have to answer to Truth Social in this case. And we think about Jerome Powell, who was picked and appointed by Donald Trump. It was not long until he was being pilloried by that very same person and being embarrassed in the hard hat, touring the Fed, and being accused of spurious allegations of spending too much on furniture and the like. We used to, it absolutely crosses a church-state divide that, as you know, we never saw in the time of Bernanke or Alan Greenspan and other people. There was a comedy among Democrats and Republicans. You just did not touch that third rail. There was a way to have moral suasion or extol the benefits of lower cost of capital, but you didn't make it as personal as it is right now.
Yeah, I mean, it's just sort of one of many norms that has been shattered by President Trump. But to give him a sort of a modicum of credit, he had said that, Warsh should go off and be his own man. So I guess it's sort of interesting that the case for rate cuts has fallen apart as soon as he's come in, and instead, if anything, they should be hiking rates. Although I don't think it's a sort of slam dunk argument, in that, a lot of the reason that inflation is going up does seem to be sort of supply side shocks, which is something that you can't really solve with rate hikes. So I don't think it's so obvious that they need to hike rates that it's sort of an abdication of their duty not to. Although I think that the case is a reasonable one. But it's interesting that it's all happened immediately as he came in, because in some ways I think that gives him more cover, because Trump doesn't want to immediately turn around and start berating him. It's too sort of embarrassing. He's just got his man. He's only just in. He's told him, you can go off and do what you want. So I don't know how much time Warsh has before he really pisses him off. He really annoys him. But I think he probably has more than a few months. And so, in some ways, it's sort of easier that everything's happening right as he came in, rather than 6 months, a year from now, for Kevin Warsh.